want to go home, but not with this situation. We want from the Korean government and the Korean people, they accept us and they deal with us as people. They need some things. We more looking for a help.
그 주변에 나라도 많은데 굳이 제주도까지 올 필요가 있어요.
예를 들어보면 캐나다 같은 경우는
난민이 차별받고 보호받지 못하는 나라에서 그 나라 국민들의 인권을 보호받을 수 있을까 하는 생각이 들어요. 난민에 대해서 잘 대우하는 정부라면 자국민의 인권도 마땅히 생각하는 그런 정부라고 생각합니다.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now by Robert Kelly. He is a political science professor at Pusan National University. Thanks so much for speaking to us. As someone who has lived and worked in South Korea for so many years now, help us better understand the mentality here. It's only 550 people who've arrived, yet hundreds of thousands of South Koreans have signed a petition to protest their staying in the country. Why this seemingly hysterical reaction?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are actually pretty surprised at just how sort of over the top it's been for just so few people. I have to say I'm actually pretty shocked myself. I've lived here for 10 years as a foreigner, and I would have thought that Koreans would respond a little bit better, to be perfectly honest. You know, Koreans themselves were refugees after the war. In the early 1950s, a lot of Koreans fled the country. There was a lot of international aid to South Korea to get it back on its feet, even to North Korea, actually. After the war, you would have thought that South Koreans would behave a little bit better. But you know, I mean, that South Korea is not really accustomed to immigration. South Korea doesn't have a Muslim population of any sizable real size. You know, it's not really accustomed to taking in refugees. It sees these people as from some conflict very far away, for which South Korea is really not responsible at all, and it has no real responsibility to take them in. The Japanese talk the same way about refugees from the Middle East too, right? That why should we take them in when it was caused by the Europeans and the Arabs and things like that. So, I mean, that's kind of the response.
Right.
I wouldn't say it's satisfactory, but that's the response.
And it seems in South Korea as well, some of them don't actually believe these asylum seekers are from an actual conflict area. Is there a lack of education here, really?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's certainly true, right? I mean, I see that all the time when I teach. I mean, Korean students just don't learn a lot about the Middle East. That's just not. Yeah, it's just not high in the agenda here. I mean, South Korea's politics, South Korea's external politics are really dominated by 5 countries: the United States, North Korea, Japan, China, and Russia. And that's really what Koreans spend a lot of their time learning. When Koreans learn foreign languages, they almost always tend to learn English. And then after that, it's maybe Chinese and maybe a European language or something like that. Korea doesn't really have Middle East experts. It's a small country. There's only 53 million of them, right? And Korea is really not deeply vested in the Middle East in any meaningful way, other than some basic import and export stuff, selling refrigerators for oil, that kind of stuff. But South Koreans don't really participate in the Middle East, and all of a sudden it's just sort of like washed up on their shores, and it has activated a lot of latent racism. I mean, racism and xenophobia are problems in Korea going back for a long time. Any foreigner who's lived here in Korea can tell you that. It's not a particularly open place, I think, particularly for dark-skinned foreigners, I think, to be perfectly blunt, and that's, I think, what you're seeing here.
And Professor, I mean, the government has to issue a response now because more than 200,000 people signed this petition. What do you think the government actually should say, and what do you expect them to say?
Yeah, I believe the government actually has. I believe the Prime Minister responded. I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to check that. But the response has basically been that, yes, South Korea has a responsibility to refugees because it did sign the UN Convention on that, right? Which is sort of a pro forma thing. It's very, very difficult for people to get to Korea because they have to fly in, right? South Korea is essentially an island because of the demilitarized zone, so it's very hard to get entry here. It ascribed to the sort of pro forma requirement, but beyond that, there's been a lot of sort of caving, quite honestly, to nationalist and racist opinion, right? We're going to check and see if they're fake refugees, which is sort of pretty ridiculous if you think about it, right? I mean, these are people from Yemen, arguably the worst civil war on the planet. I mean, suggesting they're fake refugees borders on racism, I would argue. There's going to be sort of crackdowns to make sure they're not criminals. There are going to be background checks. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of taking their cues from Donald Trump, right? I mean, Donald Trump, I think, has legitimized this kind of rhetoric. I mean, people just didn't talk this way 5 years ago about refugees, but here we are.
Right. I mean, there is a lot of irony here because, as you said, the Koreans themselves had the experience of being refugees as well during the Korean War. They face so much discrimination, for example, in Japan, where they can't actually, so many of them fight for generations just to become actual citizens of Japan, when it's really the only country they've lived in. And now here you see them, in a sense, dishing it out to others. And another issue as well is, like so many developed nations, including Japan at the top of the list, South Korea faces an exceedingly low birth rate, which many see immigration as the only real solution to. Would South Koreans not accept immigration as part of the solution to their low birth rate problem?
Yeah, that's actually sort of a really big growing debate. I mean, this is something I've said in my own writing repeatedly. I teach this stuff. I mean, Korea's birth rate is now below one live birth per female, which is just staggeringly low, right? I mean, Korea is a rapidly aging society. By like 2050, that over 65 population is going to be something like 25%. I mean, it's really, really fast. And so, yeah, at some point, Korea is going to have to take immigration. The Korean government, in my opinion, has been dragging its feet on this question, actually. I mean, when I came to Korea 10 years ago, people were talking about this and stuff, and people are still talking about it, and the government hasn't really moved on it. The government is though, responding to public opinion, right? I mean, the Koreans are just not keen on immigration. They're just not. There's a lot of racism here. There's a lot of anxiety that foreigners come and they bring crime and they spread venereal diseases and things like that. And they're here to sort of, take Koreans and sort of do all kinds of terrible things with them. Korean, foreign characters are sort of often like bad guys in Korean movies and television dramas and stuff like that. I mean, it's just not, Korea's just not as open as I think, a lot of like Western states are. And I mean, I think they're getting there. It's a lot better than when I came here, right? But they haven't, I don't think there's been enough of a national debate on immigration in Korea and the need for an improving labor force and expanding labor force. But when they do get to immigration, it's probably going to be people from Southeast Asia rather than people from the Gulf. And that's a pretty big bridge to cross for the Koreans. Okay.
But I mean, I think in that respect, they'd also be thinking about much bigger waves of immigration. Let's go back to the only 550 Yemenis that are currently applying for asylum in South Korea. And I bring up the education issue again because, as you've mentioned, they have this distorted image of what immigrants, particularly from the Middle East region, actually are, that they all have criminal records. I've heard some accounts of really local citizens there saying pretty horrible things about what they think these refugees are capable of, the crimes they're capable of committing. Where are the government efforts to educate people, to show them, to introduce them to these newcomers and to say, hey, we're all actually the same. We've faced the same trials in the past. Let's open our arms and welcome.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure that there's that kind of cosmopolitanism here. I mean, there's just not. I mean, Koreans are very nationalistic, and the Korean sense of national identity is tied up with race and genetics. It's getting better. Korea does have more foreigners now than ever before. The foreigner population in Korea is something like 4% now. You do have mixed race children. My own children are mixed race and go to Korean schools and things like that. So it's getting better. But again, a lot of that is limited to states that Koreans have some exposure to and some experience with. Think about television, right? I mean, they see a lot of American movies. They learn English. They go to the United States for school. They're accustomed to Westerners. They have some vague sense of it. They see the Eiffel Tower in the movies and things like that, right? Or, people travel in the region, right? They get on a plane and they go to China or Japan or something like that. Again, the Middle East, though, is really far away for a lot of Koreans. So not just geographically, but psychologically, right? Places like India, Latin America. Koreans just are not exposed to that. And I mean, you could argue that the Korean education system needs to be improved in that direction. I'm actually comfortable making that argument. I do think that Koreans need to spend a little bit more effort on developing states. This is something I see in my own field in political science, where Koreans just don't really show a great deal of interest in the developing world, I would argue. But I mean, that's a huge national debate, and it's going to take a long time to get there, right? I mean, hopefully the backlash to this Korean explosion of hysteria over so few people will actually move some Korean minds, right? I mean, it has, your program and, and the American media has actually gotten wind of the fact that the Koreans have really kind of lost their minds over just 500 people, right? And hopefully there'll be something of a pushback by Korea's international partners to say, wow, you have to sort of think about this stuff. You can't have these sort of racist explosions over 500 people who are fleeing a war zone.
Okay, let's hope so. Professor Kelly, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there as we're completely out of time for this segment. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us from South Korea.